ever joint summit. And since then, they've cooperated closely in areas like foreign policy, diplomacy, and trade. In April, largely in response to US President Donald Trump's global trade war, the EU and UAE launched talks on a bilateral free trade agreement, after free trade talks between the EU and GCC were suspended nearly 2 decades ago. And in recent months, the two sides have also taken a joint lead in diplomacy in the Middle East, with France and Saudi Arabia co-chairing a UN conference in late July to push for a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. So in this video, we'll explain the history of EU Gulf state relations, and why cooperation between the two blocs is now increasing.
Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell.
First, a quick history of the relations between the EU and the Gulf states. When we refer to the Gulf states, we broadly mean the 6 Arab states of the Persian Gulf: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Oman, Bahrain, and Kuwait, that are collectively known as the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC. Relations between the EU and GCC are determined by the EU-GCC Cooperation Agreement, signed in 1989, which created a joint council and committee for regular dialogue on economic relations, climate change, energy, environment, and research. In 1990, the two sides launched talks on a free trade agreement, aimed at liberalizing trade in goods and services. At the time, these negotiations were seen as groundbreaking, as an EU-GCC free trade agreement would have been the first in history between two regional blocs. However, they quickly ran into problems over the EU's stances on human rights and labour, as well as the lack of political integration between the Gulf states, with the EU being a supranational organisation and the GCC an intergovernmental one. With progress stalling, in 2008 the talks were suspended over what the EU called insurmountable differences in ambitions. There were tentative efforts to revive relations in the late 2010s, such as the EU-GCC Dialogue on Trade and Investment Issues, launched in 2017, and the EU-GCC Dialogue on Economic Diversification, launched in 2019. But these were exclusively focused on economic cooperation and didn't really take off, again in large part because of the EU's general disapproval towards the Gulf's human rights record. However, in the past couple of years or so, there's been a sudden rapprochement. This arguably began in 2023, when the UAE's COP28 presidency also brought the EU and Gulf states into dialogue on energy and climate issues, and continued with the IMEC Corridor, a proposed economic corridor linking the Middle East and Europe, which was launched at the G20 summit and endorsed by the EU and Gulf states. Then, in October 2024, the EU and GCC held their first ever official summit, where the two blocs pledged deeper economic cooperation and jointly expressed support for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the revival of a two-state solution, and de-escalation in Iran, Lebanon, Sudan, and Yemen. However, it was apparent both in the 2024 summit statement and the 2025 Joint Council statement that the EU and Gulf states aren't fully aligned on Ukraine. While both sides support a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, much of the language is very vague, and statements barely mention Russia's role. In fact, the EU's Foreign Affairs Chief, Josep Borrell, admitted this in 2024, saying, "I will not deny that there are some differences in how the European Union and Gulf Cooperation Council partners see this illegal war of aggression. This is likely because of the Gulf states' ties to Russia through OPEC+. Saudi Arabia and the UAE both see cooperation with Russia as crucial to managing global oil prices, and are therefore reluctant to risk relations with Russia by condemning the invasion of Ukraine. Nonetheless, the EU did get the GCC to at least agree that Russia should withdraw to Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, which is something. Anyway, this has all led to some concrete developments. Notably, the launching of talks on a free trade agreement between the EU and UAE earlier this year, as well as France and Saudi Arabia's joint chairing of a UN conference in July on a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. These also come as both sides attempt to navigate the less predictable Trump administration, which is intensifying global uncertainty around issues like trade and security. So this brings us nicely onto why EU Gulf state cooperation has been increasing in the past few years. And we've got 3 main suggestions for this: trade and economic issues, the EU's disregarding of human rights violations, and the rise of multilateralism. On trade, the EU wants to regain its position as the leading trade partner for GCC countries, a role that's increasingly challenged by China and India. As the European Institute for Security Studies points out, the EU was the leading trade partner for only Bahrain out of all GCC states, and it has since lost that position to Saudi Arabia. Instead, China now holds the number one spot for 4 out of 6 GCC states, with the EU ranking second in Kuwait, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. For the EU, stronger trade ties with the GCC could offset some of the disruption from Trump's global trade war and the disruption to Russian oil and gas imports. While for the GCC, the EU's stable economy and regulatory power makes it a more reliable trading partner. Both sides also have specific regional economic aims, such as through infrastructure projects like the IMEC corridor. Securing private and public investment requires regional stability, which is why the EU and GCC are collaborating on solving conflicts in the Middle East. The EU has also been stepping up its economic cooperation with Saudi Arabia. In 2024, the then president of the European Council, Charles Michel, said that the EU was ready to support Saudi Arabia's 2030 vision for the transformation of the country. And early this month, it was reported in the Saudi press that 2,500 EU companies are now active in Saudi Arabia across energy, infrastructure, and digital and green technologies. The second reason for this rapprochement, though, seems to be that the EU cares less about international human rights than maybe they once did. Saudi Arabia is one of the world's most prolific executioners, having executed at least 241 people this year. Bahrain is also among the most heavily policed countries in the world, with around 46 Interior Ministry staff for every 1,000 citizens, and the UAE is known for its unfair mass trials. Women in the Gulf states are also banned from moving around freely without the permission of a male guardian, and can be arrested in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, or Qatar if absent from their homes. Despite the EU's stated support for international human rights, the bloc's ongoing dialogue with GCC countries that violate these principles suggests that it's prepared to overlook human rights abuses for collaboration on trade and investment. Finally, the third reason for this increased EU Gulf state cooperation is multilateralism. With the American-led global order in decline, both sides are seeking to diversify their alliances and partnerships, and multilateral engagement offers a way to assert greater autonomy in an increasingly multipolar world. As such, we're beginning to see shifting relationships in the Middle East, with things constantly changing as more and more outlets are reporting on it. Right now, there are 65 sources reporting on the recent Gaza summit, with most of the coverage coming from the center. And if we dive a bit deeper, we can see that the left frames the Gaza summit as a diplomatic achievement, while the right frames it as a leadership triumph. This type of analysis is why Ground News has been my favourite way to stay up to date with the news since 2023, so I want to thank them for sponsoring this video. It's no secret by this point just how much we're fans of Ground News. They've been long-time supporters of this channel and independent news media at large. And that's because their app and website makes it easier to navigate the news. Ground News gathers thousands of articles worldwide in one place, so that you can easily compare how different outlets cover the same story. Each story comes with a visual breakdown on political bias, factuality, and who owns these sources. And it's not just me. Ground News has even been recognized by the Nobel Peace Center for its impact on media literacy. And speaking of bias, their brilliant blind spot feed allows you to fully expand your media bias and find stories that are disproportionately being covered by one side of the political spectrum or the other. After all, it's important to know the full story, and Ground News ensures you always will. If you're curious and committed to understanding what's really going on in the world, like we are, Ground News is the tool you've been looking for. And that's why we partner with them to give TLDR viewers 40% off their unlimited Vantage plan. You can subscribe through the link in the description, that's ground.news/TLDR, or by scanning the QR code on screen. And by subscribing, you're also supporting an independent news platform that's working to make the media landscape more transparent and balanced.